everyone, Emily Teague here. Today we're going to be mixing things up a bit, and instead of talking about one of my usual lighting tutorials, we're going to be talking about the editing software Capture One and how to edit in my style. So a bit about my background. When I was 15 years old, I started using Lightroom, and I absolutely loved it for years. But about 4 years ago, I was introduced to Capture One, and I ended up making the switch for numerous reasons. But the most important reasons being the advanced features, the color grading options, the difference I immediately see in a RAW file when I'm first importing it, and the ease of tethering. In today's video, I'm going to be doing an overview of how I do a basic edit within Capture One. Keep in mind the numbers that I'm choosing on the sliders, the colors, masking choices. It's not going to be a copy and paste scenario where you can apply all the same numbers to your image because every image has a different exposure, different lighting scenario, different colors. But I'll be talking about why I'm making these choices, and you'll find throughout my style of editing, it's pretty consistent. Which leads me to my next point and disclaimer, which is this is just how I edit in Capture One. This absolutely is not a strict guide on the only way to edit in Capture One, but hopefully if you're starting out and you're looking for some guidance or inspiration, this video is going to help do that for you. We'll start with this basic overview of Capture One, but if this video does well, I would love to return and talk about more specific and advanced features. But with that said, let's get started. So we're here in Capture One version 21, and this might look a little bit different if you are new to Capture One, if you're coming over from Lightroom, but the cool thing is you can actually totally customize your workspace. So there's a few different ways to do this. The first way that I'm going to show you is if you go up to Window and then down to Workspace, we have a few different options here. So we have Default, Simplified, Wedding, Migration, Dual Monitor. For anyone switching over from Lightroom who might be a little intimidated by the new workspace, you can go to Migration. Let's click on that. And this is going to be pretty similar to Lightroom. So you see you have your film strip at the bottom, you have all your adjustments to the right. And if you prefer it this way, you can totally keep it this way. I prefer to have it more how it is when you first come into Capture One. So I'm just gonna go back to Window, Workspace, and then I have my settings saved as Normal Workspace Emily. So that covers workspaces. The other thing though is lots of features are adjustable. You can drag stuff around. So if we go up to the very top section here and we right click, we can go to Customize Toolbar. And now you can see if we want to get rid of anything, if something is looking overwhelming and you're never going to use it, you can get rid of that. So for example, maybe I'm never going to use my exposure warning. I can just click that and drag it back in, and now it's disappeared from up there. Or let's say there's something in here that I would like to add in, like let's say I want to add the tips setting in. I can take that and just add it back in here, or I can move it to any other spot. So there's really a lot of options in here. Similarly, if we go over to our left-hand side where all these options are, you can see we have our white balance, our exposure, and you can just click on one of these sections and drag it anywhere you want. So if there is a specific order that you like to go in when you're editing, you can totally customize that to how you want it. Okay, so a couple things to make sure that I'm doing. I am on my little select key at the top, so that's all good. I'm on my background layer, and to that note, Capture One works in layers. So a lot of what I'm going to be doing initially will be on my background layer, and I'll talk about this more later on, but if we go to our plus right here, you can either add a new empty adjustment layer or a new field adjustment layer, or later on we'll talk about these as well, but new clone layer and new healing layer as well. But to not complicate anything, let's start just on our background layer. So style brushes I have right here. I'll also go over those later, but for now we're just going to talk about white balance, which I was moving it around earlier, but I'm just going to drag this back to the top. We're currently just on shot, and I'm looking at this image, and you'll notice as I'm making these edits, I'm staring at my image a ton to see exactly what I'm doing. So this is a tiny bit warmer than I would like. I'm just going to pull a little bit down on my Kelvin and cool this off a little bit. And that's gonna be a very small change, but to see what I've done, I'm going to hit Option on my keyboard, and then there's a reset key right here at the top. If I click that, it'll just show me that one adjustment. And for something so subtle like this, it's not going to show a lot, but to show you an example, if we take our exposure slider and I drag all the way up to something gross like that, and then I hit my Option key, and I click that reset key, that will show you just a before and after of what you're doing with this individual section. Or if I don't hit Option and I just hit the reset key, it will adjust and reset my exposure settings. So looking good here. I'm just going to go through. I think exposure is looking great. I don't need to touch that. Contrast, I do tend to add a little bit to my images, and I'm going to be repeating this a lot throughout this video, but I try to keep everything very, very subtle. It's all these subtle adjustments that add up to create a nice looking image that doesn't look so overly edited. But let's take our contrast, and as I'm raising this, I'm going to be staring at my image. So I'm dragging up slightly. Right about 7 is looking good to me. And then again, if I want to see what I've done, I can just hit Option, hit Reset, and I can see that nice, subtle contrast that I've gotten. Skipping down to brightness, I'm looking right under her eye. This spot right here is really bright. There's some very bright spots on her forehead, but I'm going to be affecting that with my highlight slider mainly. So with brightness, why don't we just go down like -2? And if I want to see exactly what I'm doing, if these settings that I'm pulling right now are too small to see, I can pull all the way down and see what it's going to do to this image. So it's affecting a lot more than just that light, bright spot on her face. So I'm going to pull down just a little bit, about -1, -2 feels good. We'll go -2. Saturation, I tend to keep my images more on the desaturated side, just because if things are too saturated, it starts getting these really clownish colors that I'm not interested in my work. So I'm gonna bring it down to about -2. Again, very, very subtle adjustments. Hold that Option key, go to Reset, and this is what I've done so far, looking good. Skipping down to our high dynamic range setting. So again, highlight here is going to be affecting those very bright spots. Let's pull it all the way down. And you can see, especially in her forehead, you can see it being affected. You can also see a little bit in the flowers, a little bit on the white in her shirt. A lot of the times I don't want to bring it all the way down, but I will go a little bit more than I would with my other settings here. So about -20 is looking fine to me. Skipping down to shadows, I tend to pull these down as well because I really like this rich kind of dark feeling in my photos. I'll pull it all the way down so you can see what it's affecting versus all the way up. Definitely don't want that. We'll pull this down to about -10. Whites, same thing. I'm just constantly showing you guys what it's affecting. So this is affecting a lot of her face. Let's bring it up to about 2, just a subtle little difference. And then blacks, let's do it again. So this is really affecting a lot of the darker areas in her clothing, in her hair, kind of near the corners. I'm going to pull this up and raise those blacks just a little bit. And then let's see what we've done with this entire section. So again, Option, hold that Reset key. Super subtle, but this is still bringing in some nice contrast. It's kind of darkening those darks that I want, while also making sure that nothing is too blown out. And as I'm looking at her face, I think we could go down even a little bit more with our highlights. So let's go down to about -25. That looks good to me. And now let's skip down to levels. So levels, there's a ton of stuff you can do. The most basic thing that I do with levels is I'm just going to take my highlights on the right-hand side and pull in slightly. Usually I'm sticking about, let's say 245 and up. We'll leave it at 245 for right now. My midtones are in this middle section here. I can either pull them to the left and I can raise them, or if I pull them to the right, I'm really going to be darkening those midtones. For my style of editing, I tend to stick on the darker side, so I'm going to pull this just ever so slightly to the right-hand side. Maybe a little bit more than that, about -0.04. And then again, I'll show you what difference this is making. But switching over to our shadows on the far left, if I pull these into the right-hand side, it's really going to bring out those shadows and deepen them. This one I really want to be subtle with because it can make a big difference very quickly. So I'm gonna leave it at 2. Now that we've done this section, let's hold our Option key again, go over to Reset, and we can see everything we've done here. Again, adding in some really nice contrast. So with our Option key, we can go to each section and hold it down and see what we've done with that individual section. So another thing we can do is I can go to my before and after slider on the top right, and if I click on this, we have this feature where we can drag and see what our image was at the very beginning. This is our raw, versus if we pull it over, we can see how it's looking after. So this is all the edits that you've done, versus if you just want to see that one individual section, which is where you're holding an option and the reset key. But this is really, really helpful also to make sure that you're not going too overboard with your editing. And then just to get rid of this, you'll click again on that before and after slider on the top. So going back, levels looking good. If I wanted to talk a little bit color grading, which I will later on, we can talk about switching to our red, green, and blue channels within levels as well. But for now, we'll just leave it on RGB. Going down to our curves layer. So we have a few options here as well. We can either work in RGB, which is affecting all of our colors, or we can go over to Luma, which is not going to be affecting our colors, but will still affect our contrast. So I tend to make a very, very subtle adjustment in here. With everything in Capture One, I don't want to go overboard, but especially with curves, whether you are in Capture One or Photoshop, a little bit of difference tends to go a long ways. So I'm just going to put a point down here by clicking. So now we have 1 point on this coordinate, and I'll put another one up here towards the top. So down here, we're going to be affecting our shadows. Up here, we're going to be affecting our highlights. And I'm just going to create a really subtle S curve. So clicking on this point and dragging slightly down, and then clicking on our highlight point at the top and dragging slightly up. So you can see very subtle difference, but already as I'm looking at this image, this top point, even though it doesn't look like much, it's way too much for me. So I'm actually gonna click on that again and bring it closer to this line. And let's see exactly what we've done with this image. So option, clicking on reset for curves. So a big difference already, but I'm liking it. And if I look at the image when I'm done with this edit and I see that I've gone too far, I can go back and adjust anything. But I think for now, this is looking okay. So again, I'm affecting my Luma curve because I don't want the color affected. And I'll leave the RGB and red, green, blue channels for another time when I'm wanting to do more color grading work. Down here, we've got clarity, which is a really nice feature, and I tend to use it a ton if I'm doing street photography, but I've noticed that when I'm shooting in studio, there's already so much detail in my skin. I'm going to zoom in by pressing Command+, and then hitting my space bar to drag up. And you can see there's so much detail in her skin. So I don't want to add even more clarity because that's just gonna make it a lot harder to retouch. I already have a ton of information there. So for this image, I'm not going to affect clarity. And then to zoom out, Command-. So we'll skip on that for now. Dehaze, I don't need that in this image. And then vignetting, I do tend to add this if it's an outside portrait, but generally when I'm in studio, I don't feel that I need it. So I'm going to skip these and I will just close these sections by clicking on the arrows to the left. And then let's see again what we've done with our before and after. So you can see we've made this image much, much darker. It's almost too dark for me. And so now I get to decide, okay, what do I want to lift a little bit? My first thought is going to the high dynamic range and taking the blacks and raising those a little bit. So let's go to about 15, 16. That's looking better already to me. We can also look at our shadow. Instead of -10, I might go about -8. And just to let you guys know where my head's at as I'm changing these numbers, everything that I'm doing, I'm looking at the image and I'm seeing exactly how I affect it. There's no magic number of if you go to -8 or if you go to +15, that's the correct number. It's all just about your individual image and how it's affecting it. But for now, I'm gonna say this is a pretty good basic edit for me. So why don't we start talking about other options? Okay, so this whole time we've been working in our exposure tab, which you can see at the top, but we're about to work in our color tab instead. But before I do anything else, I'm going to go down to my layer section, which we're now ready to talk about. So I've been working on my background layer, but for color, I tend to go too far with color and not realize it until after. And then instead of making all these adjustments, what I can do is I can just affect the opacity of my layer, which is a lot easier. So let's create a new layer for this. I'm going to the plus right here, and I'm going to create a new filled adjustment layer. And this just means everything, all these adjustments that I'm making are already there within that layer. And I'm going to rename this. So instead of adjustment layer 1, I will double click and just name this color. And you can see on the right-hand side, we are at 100% opacity for this layer. This check mark on the left is just showing that layer on and off, which when we actually make some changes will make sense. But now let's move over to our color tab up at the top here. So in this tab, there's really two main things that I'm looking at, and that is my color balance and my color editor. So starting with color balance, this is honestly one of the reasons that I ended up deciding to switch to Capture One, because this is such an amazing and advanced feature. So we have our master color, three-way, which is just going to be showing you the shadows, midtones, and highlights all together. And then with that said, shadows, midtones, and highlights. So let's start with master. For this, it's all about feeling and emotion. There's no correct color, or at least not in the way that I work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to this middle section right here, and I'm just going to click on it. And now I'm going to drag it all the way around the wheel. And as I'm doing this, you'll see my image is updating with those colors. And so if I pull it close to the center, that is going to be less saturation, or if I pull it all the way to the outside edge, that's going to be full saturation. So just to see how this image is feeling with each color, I'm keeping it close to the outside edge with full saturation. And I'm just gonna move it around slowly and see what color kind of speaks to me and resonates with the emotion that I was capturing in this photo. So these lighter colors aren't doing it for me, and generally they don't. I tend to stick with cooler colors also because my images tend to have this kind of rich, royal, moody feel to them. So once I start getting in this kind of blue, dark green, dark purple area, that's where I tend to be happiest. For this image, I'm really liking this dark blue color. That's looking beautiful to me. Right about there looks pretty good. And so once I decide on that color, obviously we don't want to leave it fully saturated. So instead of dragging it to the center, I can go to the left-hand side where there's this bar, and I will click on the top, and I'm just going to drag this down. And you see if I drag it all the way down, this is 0% saturation, and I'm gonna start there, and I'm just going to slowly drag it up until it starts feeling pretty good. And right about there is looking good to me. And again, similar to how we were doing it before, if we want to see what we've been doing just with our color balance, I can press my Option key, press the Reset key, and I can see everything that I've done. And as we start adding in more color, that'll start becoming a much more obvious change. So I'm going to skip three-way just because this is showing you all of them, and we'll go right into shadows, which I love affecting the colors in shadows. So, and it tends to be pretty close to the color that I decide for master, but let's drag this around again. And I'm just looking at how all these different colors are affecting the image. I love once we get to the blues, that's looking really good. Greens are looking kind of fun too. I think for this, I'm gonna stick closer to that blue and purple. Purple's a little too much for me, let's go closer to blue. Right about there. So kind of in between blue, purple, that's looking really nice. So now we have two options. One, we're gonna take our saturation like we did before and drag it way down. Right about there, keeping it subtle. But then we also have the option of our luminosity. So this slider on the right-hand side is our luminosity. And if we bring it all the way up, you can see that's pulling your luminosity all the way up, which doesn't look really great here. Or if we pull it all the way down, also doesn't look really great. But if we affect this subtly, it can be really nice. So generally with my shadows, I tend to pull my luminosity down a little bit. Right about there is looking good. And again, let's see what we've done. Option key, Reset key. And now you can really see it a lot more. This is looking great. I can already tell this is going to end up being too much for me. But again, like we talked about with our layers and our opacity, at the very end, I can just go in, take the opacity of the entire layer and bring it down a bit. But for now, I'm feeling good about this. So let's skip over to our midtones. Same as before, again, there's gonna be a lot of repetition here, but with midtones and with highlights, it can go, well, with midtones, it can go either way for me. With highlights, I tend to stick with lighter colors, usually yellow to complement the blue that I've chosen for my shadows. But with midtones, let's pull it around and see what's looking good. And this is affecting her skin a lot. So these colors like pink, like orange, all of that isn't sparking a lot of joy for me. This is looking a lot nicer though. So kind of closer to this like cyan green. I'm liking that. It's giving this really nice effect. So let's pull this one down. I'm gonna pull the saturation on this down even more than I did with my shadows. And for the midtones, I don't feel like my luminosity needs to change at all, so I'm just gonna leave that there. But let's skip over to highlights. And as I mentioned, because I have this cooler tone, the blue for my shadows and my master color, I'm going to complement that with a lighter color, the yellow, for my highlights. And also the highlights are really affecting her skin tone. So if we pull it all the way up, you can see this is all about her skin. So let's stick right around there. And I'm gonna bring this way down. That's looking pretty good. Sometimes with luminosity, I might bring this up a little bit for highlights, but again, I don't feel like this image needs it very much, but I will bring my saturation up just a little bit as I'm looking at this image. So now let's see what we've done. Holding the Option key, clicking on color balance. This is everything that we've done for it, which it's giving this a really nice feel, but as I suspected, I'm gonna wanna bring this down a little bit. So I can go to my color layer right here, and right above it, we have our opacity. So let's slide it all the way down. This is with no adjustment. I'm gonna say normally for me, it's within about 60 to 70% because I get close to what I want, but then I think, okay, this can be a little bit more subtle. That's looking pretty good to me. Our color editor, so there's a couple different options in here. We have basic, which looks pretty similar to how it does in Lightroom. If you're coming from Lightroom, we just have all our individual colors, as well as our global color. And then we also have advanced and skin tone. And so for this, I'm actually gonna show you another image, and I'm gonna try to keep this video short, but I'm gonna try to also show you as many features as I can without it getting overwhelming. But for now, I'm saying this looks pretty good for color. I won't go into it too much for now, but if we go back to our exposure tab, as I mentioned before, we can also affect the color with our levels or with our curves. So I'm gonna do something really quick, and I'm just gonna go to our red channel within levels. So we're still working with our shadows, our midtones, and our highlights, but we're also working with color now. So let's take our shadows within red, and if we start pulling this in, we're gonna get this really nice blue color to complement it. And so now in our shadows of this image, we're having a lot of blue. So this is way too much for me, but again, let's bring it to about 2, 3, something nice and subtle. And it's complementing that kind of blue color grading that we've already been giving it. With our midtones, if you see if we pull it all the way to the left, that's really bringing in that red, versus if we pull it all the way to the right, that's bringing in that kind of blue-green color again. So I'm going to pull it just ever so slightly to the right at negative 0.02, looks pretty good to me. And then let's skip over, just to show you guys, if you want, you can do the same thing with green, with blue, but I think right now just bringing in a little bit of blue through the red channel feels good to me. Similar with curves, you have your red, your green, and your blue channels here, which you can also affect. Let's do something just as an example here. So I'll make a point down here, and if I pull way down, it starts bringing in this really nice, warm, kind of yellow color, but I don't want to bring in too much, so keeping very close to the line, right about there. Let's see how that looks. So subtle, it's really kind of like what we were doing with the highlight, bringing in that yellow. We're doing just a little bit of that here too. So and actually as I'm staring at this image, I'm like, too much yellow. So I'm actually gonna bring it up even more, and maybe we won't play with that for now. But let's look at everything we've done in this image so far with our before and after. So before, this is our raw file, and after. And I do notice as I'm doing this, I think there's still too much black in here. So I'm just gonna leave my before and after slider up, and then instead of working on my color tab up here, I'm gonna go down to background again, where we made all of our exposure adjustments. And I will go down to levels down here. And I'm gonna go to my midtones where there's a lot of this dark, and instead of bringing it down like I thought I wanted, I'm actually gonna raise it a little bit because that will start to help raise some of those dark areas. Right about there, and then let's switch this on and off. That's looking pretty good for me. If I was going more into this, which I don't want to because I know this video is already gonna get long, I might fine tune this a little bit more, bring those blacks higher up, but as an overall edit, I'm thinking this looks pretty good. Okay, so next thing to show you guys, which is just a really quick feature, and it's hard because I want to show you every feature in Capture One, but I'm also trying to make this video not go an hour long. So let's go over to our plus side on the layers again, and we're gonna go down to New Heal Layer. So that will come at the top, and then we have all these little tools right here. We have our eraser tool. We're gonna go over to Draw Healing Mask. And then I'm going to press Command plus again to get in closer. And if I need to readjust it all, I will just hit spacebar and move it up so slightly. But I'm just looking at these little blemishes that are distracting, and I'm just gonna take a few of them out just by clicking. And it's going to select an area of skin around it that is good. So something like this, where the blemish is bigger than my brush size, I can hit my bracket key. The bracket on the right will make our brush larger, and the bracket on the left will make our brush smaller. But let's go a little bit larger so I can select this whole area. That's looking good. I can also draw with this as well. So let's say there are a few blemishes in a row that I want to get rid of, maybe right here. If I press and hold, I can just draw that little brush and that'll select that entire area for me. So I can go through and do this quite a bit, selecting areas like that. I will say for all my fine-tune retouching, I still export my file from Capture One over to Photoshop, but if I want to stay in Capture One, this is a really nice feature. So that's looking pretty good to me. I'm going to turn this on and off and just see what I've done with those blemishes. Let's get rid of a couple more just to show the difference. And then again, clicking on and off with this heal layer to see exactly what we've done. That looks pretty good. So this image is looking pretty good to me. Again, if this was a real edit, I would probably fine tune my colors, my adjustments a little bit, go in maybe a little bit more and clean some stuff up, but I'm gonna say this looks pretty good. So one final feature that is worth showing you guys is I'm actually gonna go to a different image. This is my other image, and just real quick before I can do anything, I'm going to crop this image a little bit so we can get rid of her bra at the bottom and just kind of recompose it. So if I press C on the keyboard, it will automatically go to my crop tool. I'm just going to go to the corner and bring this in a little bit. Right about there, and then just for a nicer composition, I'll go to my top left-hand corner and bring that in slightly too. Right about there looks good for me. And then I'll switch back to my select key and we'll have our new crop. So for this, I'm just going to be showing you the advanced color editor and one way that you can use it. So let's say we have some really bright, fun colors in this image. Let's say we really want to play with our background color. Something that we can do is go back to our layers, go to New Filled Adjustment Layer, and we will rename this Background Color. And now let's go back to our color tab. So in here, we're gonna go down to Advanced. Again, we have our basic, advanced, and skin tone, which I would love to talk about another time, but for now we'll go to Advanced. We're going to go to the bottom where our eyedropper is and select the background. So once we select it, you'll see it's going to, zoomed in, it's going to show up on our color wheel. And there's a couple things we can do here. If we want to completely isolate that color, if we take our smoothness and we pull it all the way down to 1, then it's only going to be affecting this specific color within our color wheel. Or if we want it to bleed out a little bit and affect similar colors, we can start pulling it up, and you'll notice that that is gradually going to bleed into our greens, into our blues. But for now, let's just keep it right about there. You know what? Actually, for this reason, we can keep it anywhere because I'm gonna show you guys pretty soon what we're gonna do. So 15 sounds good. So now why don't we start playing around with our hue? So as I'm doing this, I'm looking at my background If we pull it all the way down, we get this really fun, like sea foam kind of color, or if we pull it all the way up, it's gonna go more into that purple color. But I really like this fun sea foam color. And then with our saturation, let's crank it. This is probably way more than I would normally do for my style, but this looks pretty good. So now I'm like, wow, this looks cool. The only issue that we have is this background color is very similar to what was on her eyes. So we have a couple options here, because let's say we don't want her eyes to be affected by this at all. One, we can try going to our smoothness and isolating that color, which we just did, but even when we isolate it, it's still picking up because the color is so similar to our background. So that's not gonna work. So now what we can do is go to our eraser tool right here and start erasing near her eye. And that is gonna get rid of all that cyan color that was on the background. So let's go to our background layer and turn it on and off. And you can see now we are just having to worry about that on our background. So this is looking good for this image. Going back to this one, again, now that I've had a little bit of space, I can see this is actually too much color for me again. So final thing I'll do just before we end this is I'm gonna bring this color on my opacity down to like, let's say 30%. Let's turn that on and off. And that's a more subtle grade for me. So that's looking good. So this one is our overview of a basic edit. And this is showing just that advanced color editor, but hopefully this helps show you guys a little bit what you can do in Capture One. So that was a lot of information packed in very concisely, and I hope it wasn't too much information, but there's so much to cover in Capture One, and hopefully this video does well, and if it does, I will go into more specific features and talk slower about all of those as well. So I hope you guys liked it. Let me know in the comments what you think, and I will see you guys next time.